Requiem aeterna.
Hi there, this is Brent.
And this is Amanda.
We are the Unreliable Narrators.
Here to talk about the strangeness, the mystery, and the wonder of Gene Wolfe's prose.
What is time?
What is memory?
What is a person?
Is this reality?
Where are we?
Do we exist?
Have you ever considered that all your choices are what brought you right here to this very moment?
Episode number 19, Justice, by Dan Knight. Published November 7th, 2015, in Feast of Laughter, volume number 3. This is an interesting story. Justice is the title, and justice is the theme. It follows a character, Hieronius Smith, who is needing to verify his parentage in order to justify his existence. And if he can't provide the right bloodlines or the right bona fides, then he's going to owe a great deal of money. I believe at one point it's $100,000. And if he can't pay the money, then they're going to render him down for fat and fertilizer. So it goes through the accusation that he had provided false Ancestry.com results, although Ancestry.com does not come in. Then he goes and hunts for more, and there's a series of vignettes where he is attempting to prove that he has some kind of defensible parentage. And in the end, he is not entirely rendered down, though he loses a finger. This is an odd one. It's also not by Gene Wolfe.
No.
So, Brent, why is it that the Unreliable Narrators are talking about a story by Dan Knight? Who is Dan Knight, and why is his story important and significant?
For people who have copies of The Young Wolf.
Ah, yes, that collection of early Gene Wolfe stories.
Yeah, there's one page with a very short paragraph where the editor asked Wolfe if he had any unpublished stories, and yes, Wolfe did.
Yes.
That editor and that very short section in The Young Wolf that's not Wolfe's writing, so that was Dan Knight. And he was the one who ran United Mythologies Press, and they published Wolfe and R.A. Lafferty. And so a lot of R.A. Lafferty's, I don't know what you'd call it, like more difficult to publish works.
Some of his more obscure stuff.
Yeah, so they were published through Dan Knight, and then Wolfe's Letters from Home, The Young Wolf, Wolfe's Orbital Thoughts, several of those chapbooks and stuff, those came from United Mythologies Press.
And the efforts of Dan Knight.
Yes.
We discovered Dan Knight through a convoluted series of incidents, a Reddit post about a Facebook post about him selling off some extra copies that he had.
Yeah. And so we contacted him, and we were able to get some copies of the Letters Home and Orbital Thoughts and Wolf Family album.
Yes.
Some of those less common things that you see in bibliographies of Wolfe.
Yes.
And talking to Dan,
he initiated a conversation because our orders came in 2 minutes apart and had mailing addresses from the same city. And he noticed that. And therefore, he asked Brent if Brent knew me because our orders had come in together. And then he immediately felt guilty because he was like, I just realized I might have doxed somebody and I shouldn't have. And Brent was like, no. We were sitting next to each other when we ordered the books. So we do know each other. There was no information being introduced here.
Yep. And then so talking with him, he used to run a fanzine. It was the Boomer Flats Gazette.
Yes.
And then he's also a published author in his own right. And he has several short stories published. They're mostly in Canadian science fiction magazines, so they're a little bit harder to get.
Yeah. And then he also had a collection of, is it unpublished stories that he needed help getting into a digital format? And so he reached out to Brent for a little assistance with that, since Brent has the technical know-how to make those things happen.
Yeah. So those were unpublished, and those are ones that hopefully by the time this podcast is published, supposed to be summer of 2024 was the last estimate I heard from him.
For the publication date for that collection.
Yeah. And that'll be available on Amazon.
Yeah. So Dan Knight, and is there a working title yet?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. Dan Knight's short stories.
Yeah. So this particular one, this is in Feast of Laughter.
Yes.
So this was written before 2015, but this was one that he had sent R.A. Lafferty because they communicated and they had a lot of correspondence. And then when R.A. Lafferty passed away, Lafferty still had the copy of Justice, and he hadn't sent it back to Dan. And then Dan had forgotten about it.
Yeah, didn't it get tucked into an archive somewhere?
Yeah, it got tucked into the university archive. And then when people were searching for some R.A. Lafferty works, they noticed that some of Dan Knight's papers and also correspondence were in the Lafferty archive. And then they reached out to him and asked if they could publish it in the Feast of Laughter.
Yeah, so we've got a short story that appears in Feast of Laughter. Any more background that we need to, or shall we get into it?
He thought it was funny when they published it.
Yes.
Because the disclaimer
is almost as long as the story.
Is almost as long as the story. Well, I'll quote that when we get to the end.
So it's an older story that then gets published in 2015, yes, with a disclaimer attached to it. But we're definitely dealing with a satirical story from the beginning. And the disclaimer goes extensively into Horatian versus Juvenalian satire, but I don't think you need to worry too much about the distinction between different kinds of satire to appreciate that Knight is making a point by exaggerating.
Yeah, I think that it could have been summarized better than the afterword with this. So Harrison Bergeron is a satirical dystopian science fiction short story by American writer Kurt Vonnegut. If you would have taken that and said, Justice is a satirical dystopian science fiction short story by Canadian writer Dan Knight,
that would have covered all of the bases. Yeah, it's obviously satirical from the beginning. But Hieronymus Smith basically seems to be, I don't know, answering the door or answering the phone. And it's someone named Holster from the Bureau of Enforced Restitution and Payments.
I like that. Burp? You're the man from Burp?
I fail to see any humor in that, Mr. Smith. So we have Dan Knight calling out the fact that this is satirical from the very beginning. I also feel like if anybody's seen any Monty Python, they're not going to think this goes too far.
No.
Just fair warning. Okay, so the representative from Burp shows up and says that Mr. Smith has misrepresented himself on his return. And so obviously I'm immediately thinking of a tax return.
We're kind of in this Kafka-esque bureaucracy where we're dropped in and we don't know. It's very serious misrepresentations, meaning the company you retain to complete your return has classified you as a 4BBB with 2 public service exemptions. In point of fact, you are a 12F with no exemptions at all.
And I feel my eyes glazing over, much like I do when I look at any kind of tax form and feeling overwhelmed by the possibilities here. And they're all terrible.
We get that Kafka-esque, we don't know what's going on. Our main character doesn't necessarily understand what's going on either.
Yeah, and because he's misrepresented himself, he owes a considerable amount of money. And in view of the fact that it's such a large sum, the Bureau will not be insisting on immediate payment. You'll get 60 days. And then we find out that it's $100,000.
Mm-hmm. So if this was originally written decades ago, this would have been more than the price of a starter house.
Right. $100,000 this had to have been written at least 25 years ago, and that would be 500,000 today.
Mm-hmm. I like the end here where it says, in your case, I would not rule out final closure and liquidation.
Yes, and which you initially read as like liquidating assets,
Mm-hmm.
and then you later figure out is more like liquidating ass and body, and I don't know.
Yeah, wait, I thought we didn't have the explicit check mark.
Sorry, I apologize. I apologize to all your children that have been forced to listen to us anyway.
Yeah, so then there's a joke here. Do you have a hearing impairment?
Right.
Which I get, maybe that might be something in his favor if he does, but...
Right, but clearly he does not. So then his wife is like, what's happening? You know, it's trouble. Again? What is it this time? Oh, they've audited me. We all know how terrifying the word audit is. Oh, Hyro, is it bad? It doesn't look too good. Seems great-great-granddad wasn't Swiss at all. He was French.
I like her response. Oh, no.
I know this is a Canadian author, but as an American, I like that. It gets worse. My exemptions for Great Aunt Edith's suffragetting and 3 times Great Granddad Penny's slavery abolitionist work are both denied. How much is it going to cost? Let's see. Restitution to former colonies, environmental damage from South Seas nuclear testing, overfishing, weapon sales, about $15,000 a year for each of the past 5 years plus interest. That's $100,000. We don't have that kind of money. What'll we do? I don't know. I just don't know. We could take a mortgage on my grandparents. Wow, I don't know what it would be to mortgage one's grandparents.
I don't know either, but we get the Luella Smith, the wife.
Well, she has First Nations ancestry.
Yeah. Sorry, I was getting ready to say Native American ancestry, but it's like,
But
that's
she's
not
Canadian.
Yeah. It's like First Nations ancestry. So she has, I think part of the implication being there is that she can take the goodwill of the First Nations heritage and they can mortgage that out to get him out of.
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and make the subtext here. So this is a futuristic dystopia in which a colonist ancestry is something that you become legally, financially obligated to pay for. And so you have a certain amount of money you have to pay every year because you are descended from exploiters. And so the only way you can avoid these kinds of payments is if you belong to a tribe or group that was exploited instead of exploiting.
Yeah. And there seems to be this whole game about who can you attach to?
We've never seen this in modern society at all.
No.
But it's clearly a spoof of the kind of thing that would be like the 23andMe thing, or just my parents told me that there was a Cherokee princess in our ancestry, or whatever the legends are, where you have some sort of attachment to the colonized people instead of what is typically most obvious is that you're white and you seem white, but you're like, but no, I have Creole ancestors, or no, I have First Nations ancestry. And therefore, I somehow can align myself with the oppressed through one great-grandparent.
Yeah. This was written before it may have been published later, because there's a whole, with like the tribes, now that they're getting more money in here in the United States from the casinos and stuff. Before, it was rather inclusive about what it meant to be a tribe member. Now it's like, well, no, you're not Native American enough to get payments out.
Yeah, and we have that also aligned with the ancestry tracing, where people are doing genetic research to figure out where they're descended from. So you have the confluence of these things.
The other thing I was thinking about, we just had in Idaho, there was I can't remember the gal's name now, but she was white and she was tanning and getting her hair.
Oh, yes. Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal.
Yes. Thank you. And so she was pretending like she was partial.
Well, and she ended up having an official position in the NAACP.
Mm-hmm.
even though she had entirely white ancestry and was passing herself off with tanning and braids in her hair.
Yeah. It's like this is satirical, but at the same time, it wasn't satirical enough in some ways.
Right, because we've jumped that shark. I have an acquaintance whose family for a long time claimed Native American ancestry, very recent Native American ancestry. And they did a genetic test and found out that there were no markers for Native American ancestry, but there were a lot of markers for African ancestry. And then after this happened and they told me about it, I went and did some reading. And apparently that was one of the ways that people who had mixed ancestry at a time when it was not socially acceptable to explain darker skin, it was more socially acceptable to identify with a native tribe than it was to identify with formerly enslaved persons.
So the context there for taking a mortgage out on my grandparents,
Yes.
the wife saying this is that we can try to cover the taxation on your ancestors' misdeeds and sins and atrocities by taking out money on them being victims of your ancestors.
Which is just Knight making literal the social capital that goes into something like this. Oh, yes, I'm identified with these people, and you get social currency out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't we have a presidential candidate at one time claimed Native ancestry? And then I feel like there was a big kerfluffle 10 or 15 years ago about this.
Yeah. I can't remember. Warren?
Oh, yes. Elizabeth Warren.
Yes.
Yes.
I think that this section here between husband and wife is important because he makes the comment, like, I don't know why you married me. And he's referring to his genetic ancestry.
Right.
Which is abstracted and dehumanizing.
Yes.
And she brings it forward, and it's because she loves you. Like, I, as an individual, love you as a person.
Yeah, so he's abstracting it. Why would a person with the bona fides you have marry someone like me without those bona fides? And then she's like, yeah, because we're two people that loved each other.
Mm-hmm. I like this comment here. I've got the blood of every major empire building race in my veins.
And there isn't a man anywhere that I don't owe. As someone who's done the 23andMe thing and who has all of those northern countries highlighted, I identify strongly here. Either my ancestors were Vikings invading European countries or they were Europeans invading other countries. That's all I've got, people.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be taxed if I end up in this futuristic dystopia.
Our next scene here, he goes to the tax preparation place. And you just get the sense that I assume this happens in other states. I know it really doesn't happen in other countries, but every time it gets to be the last day of tax day, the closer it gets, you get the people waving signs or dressed up like the tax prep.
Yes.
I get the sense that this is one of those kind of fly-by-night
ancestry prep.
Yeah, it's like the cheap
yes
version of it. Because he shows up there, she's basically like, oh, yeah, most definitely our fault. I'd say it was almost criminal the way we messed up your declaration.
Yeah. And totally owning that they have screwed him. Sorry, this is a second language warning in one episode. My apologies.
You're going to get us blacklisted on
I'm
Apple.
I'm sorry. If they're reading Gene Wolfe, they can handle...
Yeah, no.
Okay. A word for a donkey and a word for a fastening device. Kind of like a nail, but not. Anyway.
With the inclined plane twisted around it.
Yeah, something like that.
So he says that he's going to lawyer up.
Yeah, and they're totally indifferent until he threatens them with bad press.
Uh-huh. And the other thing, too, is she's leaning over. She, like, adjusts her dress. And
I know. She totally flashes him.
Uh-huh. It's like bad press and like, oh, don't want to get the papers. And he's talking about how he's going to go to the competitor and just...
And she's like, you wouldn't do that. And he says, bet your Navajo grandmother I would. Which seems like a racial slur, but not.
Yeah. Well, and it makes sense. So in the previous episode, we were talking about minced oath.
Yes.
And minced oaths are where you don't want to sully something that you hold dear, but a lot of times when there's the need to like shout explanation, those
Yes.
are the things that you hold dear are what come out.
Yes.
And so I think this just goes to show when somebody's talking about, you bet your Navajo grandmother that you're interacting with people and you know their ancestry or who they're connected to. We don't really know how, but it's here in the dialogue. So
Yes. Yeah.
So they admit fault, and basically she's like, well, yeah, we'll try to rush and get this done. But
Yeah. So hopefully before his 60 days are up, they'll have done some research in order to clear him of some of these charges.
mm-hmm.
And so then he goes and talks to Fred Greasy Fingers, which, in case you didn't know that this was satire, this is satire?
Yeah. Here's the other thing. Not only is it Greasy Fingers, but he's passing them bills with Nixon's face on it.
That one's over the top.
Nixon says you're all right. I don't know, though.
I can't even.
You got anyone else who can speak for you? JFK. Much better. Much better.
Yeah. And this is fun on a couple of levels because it's a futuristic world where apparently we've put Nixon and JFK on the money. It's also kind of funny because this is a Canadian writer. And my sense is that I actually don't know objectively what the numbers are here, but my sense is that US currency tends to maintain its appearance much more consistently than a lot of other nations' currency. That they change what's on their bills a lot more often than we tend to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the amount of belly aching that happened over changing the penny, the cent, put the shield on the back.
Belly aching. That's a good word for it.
So he's gone to organized crime now.
Yeah, so he's looking for a loan.
Yep.
Or a justification. Falsify some records for me.
And so Greasy Fingers brokers a connection between him and, I believe that this is a hacker, the way it's described. He's got some kind of device.
Yeah, a flexible plastic keyboard.
Yeah, and he's on what would essentially be like a payphone dialed in. And the hacker says, a guardian angel, a very special friend. And the hacker's pulling himself out of the situation because it's so bad. There's publicity on this.
Yes.
The government's involved, and he doesn't want to touch it. It's too hot to touch.
Yeah.
Then he gets robbed here at the end, too.
Yes. So he gets robbed of the bribe money.
Yeah. So then he's even more in the hole.
Yes. So he ends up 31,000 short at the end of that scene. And then we
decide to Ruby Ridge it.
I don't know. That feels a little close to home.
Okay.
Talking about Ruby Ridge. For those of you listeners who don't know, a certain podcast member grew up around the Ruby Ridge catastrophe and people that were associated with the Ruby Ridge catastrophe. So yes, he gets into a confrontation with the police in his driveway. And I know this is a futuristic dystopia, but it is Canada. And so I've got images of Mounties and pop guns, basically, because that's my picture. I'm sorry, Canada. I love you. You're a wonderful place. I like maple syrup and moose. But
wow. Basically, what I heard is that my knowledge of Canada is informed by northern exposure.
Well, I grew up in northern Idaho. So I think I don't have any justification for my stereotyping. I apologize, Canada. But having grown up around that whole American level of chaos, there is sort of a bit of disbelief that it could get that bad in Canada. I'm not saying it couldn't, but there's a little bit of disbelief, aesthetic disbelief. How's that?
Yeah.
You're all too nice.
So he's got a rocket launcher
yes.
and he's got tracer rounds and he's shooting at an armored car.
Yeah, and then he surrenders and they say, I understand. We have awakened your morality. And then he's like, no, lack of bullets. So he ran out of ammo.
Yeah.
Which is how we also know he's Canadian, because no American, I'm sorry, no Idahoan?
Just keep digging there.
I'm buried at this point.
Well, and the other part of it, too, is the neighbors are involved.
Yes.
And they're like, don't hit my roses.
Yes. Well, they also threaten his children.
Mm-hmm.
The police Or maybe it's the neighbors that threaten his children.
Yeah, my reading was the neighbors threatening the children.
Yeah.
So then he gives up.
Yeah, gets taken in.
And then we kind of get the peeling back of the dehumanization. It's a little more explicit here in this last scene. Before, it's been there in the interactions, and it's been there in the way people talk. So when they're talking about Mr. Smith, we're getting this abstracting of, oh, your ancestors, oh, you did this. And then he'll say, but I didn't do that. And then kind of the counterpoint to that is his wife's grounding it in, no, you're an individual. I'm an individual. This last scene here, we definitely get more of the dehumanizing. He objects. It's not like I've broken any laws. I've lived a quiet life. I've never even cheated on my taxes. Why me?
Oh, but you have, Mr. Smith. You have broken the law. You have broken the first law of modern living. You have allowed yourself to be noticed by your government. As you can now see, it was a very foolish thing to do. I feel like that's the sharpest point, the sharpest edge. Just don't get noticed.
This was written before cancel culture was a thing.
Yes.
Blend in. Gray rocket.
Yeah, but I think my entire adult life and young adult life, I've known that the worst thing to have happen to you is that you get selected for an audit. And so a lot of the things that people do around their taxes is try not to stand out.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just following the law to follow the law. It's trying to follow the custom that isn't exactly the law, but keeps you flying beneath the radar so that you don't stand out.
Yeah, so you're not an outlier.
Exactly.
And then this is where we get, you were noticed by the government. So then this is where we get kind of what the hacker had picked up on and why he didn't want to touch any of the stuff, because it's a big enough case and it's public enough that it would be obvious that there were tampering going on if he did anything.
Yeah, but what have I really done? He asks. And then Holster, great name, says, nothing, Mr. Smith, absolutely nothing, just as the millions your ancestors enslaved or abused were doing. So making explicit here you are being punished for their sins.
Yeah. And he goes on to say, you are not what's important here. You are worthless. It is what you represent that is of significance. Think of yourself as a sin offering.
I mean, that's maybe a little heavy-handed. I don't want to be critical here, but that's pretty explicit.
And yeah, scapegoat.
Yep.
I mean, we use that.
Literally use that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For Azazel. Up at the paragraph up to, it talks about like a cheap fly-by-night company. So this confirmation that the in the box 23andMe thing.
Right.
Yeah, no, it literally was.
Yeah, whoever you hired to provide your genetic bona fides was not a legit. Yeah. You were just going with the guy flipping a sign on the road.
And it's so bad that they've actually put it up on the bulletin board so people can laugh at it inside the office.
Yeah, and then he's like, you're worthless, you're a sin offering. It doesn't matter that you are a meek man. We don't want specifics clouding the beauty of the system. And if that isn't an indictment of modern political discourse, I don't know what is. Specifics cloud the beauty of the system. Anytime you're interacting with an individual, your platitudes, your sloganeering, your rigid structure, it falls apart.
Yeah. I've read studies on this when they have people and they see posts online, like on social media. It's like, oh, that's them talking. And then they'll do experiments where then they actually get people together and they'll purposely bring together people that have very different views. But when they're talking in person, it's harder to demonize someone when there's a face and a personality, when there's a living, breathing being there.
And this actually, it was really interesting to reread this for recording today, because I had just read on Alan Jacobs' blog in a post titled Conceptual Marxism, how whether or not you identify with Marxian philosophy, we live in an era of conceptual Marxism where the intellectual structure of Marxian philosophy has captured the imagination. basically, this idea is that the history of the world, the history of society, is the history of class struggle. And class struggle is a conflict between the oppressor and the oppressed, which is putting everything into a totally evil and then also a totally good binary. And whether you accept Marxism or not, or even if you think you're very far from Marxism, you are the opposite of Marxism, you are capitalist and whatever, you have to just conceptually in our world, you have to think of them as the other. So if you are on the right, then the left hate America and hate society and hate civilization and hate order.
Mm-hmm.
And you are the defenders of good and freedom. And if you are on the left, then the right doesn't have any good thing that they're defending. They are totally depraved. And the point of everything they think is the cruelty and the oppression. Like, you'll literally read this phrase, like, the cruelty is the point, is a talking point opposed to certain right-wing political ideas. And then on the right, I think, well, I actually know that there's a book out there that's literally The Left Hates America, or Why the Left Hates America. And so this idea that everything is diametrically opposed,
Mm-hmm.
that the only course of history is a basic struggle between those who are totally good and those are totally evil. Alan Jacobs was arguing that this is the Marxist conceptual takeover. So you could reject the tenets of Marxism, but you still have this concept of total opposition that has become the entirety of political discourse. And it's right here in Dan's story. And it's that we don't want specifics clouding the beauty of the system. Never mind that I politically disagree with my in-laws, who I love as human beings, but disagree with a political philosophy they advance. I think they're trying to advance that political philosophy for good reasons. I think they're mistaken about the effectiveness of that policy, but I think they're good people who want to do the right thing. And they think I'm mistaken, but they think I'm a good person who wants to do the right thing. That's specifics that cloud the issue and make it really hard to hate people, which I think is supposed to be a good thing. But in the story, we don't want to know that Hieronymus Smith, and by the way, Hieronymus, did you do any research on that name?
Oh, I did not.
Okay, because I Googled it thinking, well, surely there's a rich philosophical, conceptual backstory here. And the only thing I found, which was like multiple pages of Google search results, which by the time you go past the first page, that's basically the dark web, right?
Sure.
Sorry. That was a joke just for you. Hieronymus is a D&D god, a god in a D&D campaign.
Oh.
And Hieronymus is the god of justice, which is what makes me think that was deliberate.
Oh.
I feel like we need to ask Dan Knight if he plays D&D or has friends that play D&D or children that play D&D.
Yeah.
Because his name is actually invoking
the
justice.
Title of the story.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. Now I feel called out on air.
Okay, you had all 47 of the looked up references in our last episode, so I can have one in this episode.
No, that's fair.
Anyway, so nobody cares if he himself is a person of justice.
Mm-hmm.
He has to be forced into the beauty of the system, which is all of history is a class struggle.
Yep. You are a monster, Mr. Smith. And if you are not, then we will make you one.
Yes. Oh, my goodness.
A rebellious, unrepentant sinner to whom society extends the only kindness it can, the opportunity to make some small payment of the vast debt you owe us, and so die at least partially redeemed.
Yeah. We will break you up and take from your body what we can use. The rest will be ground up to fertilize our hungry fields. Huh. There is also, of course, the small pleasure which some of the less refined of our citizens take in watching the proceedings on their televisions. So clearly we just went straight back to the Roman Empire and the gladiatorial games and torture of Christians in the Colosseum.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'm horrified.
And something that stood out here, too, is so die and at least partially redeemed.
Yes.
His perceived sins in the system are larger than his human life can be.
Yes.
I don't know what I think or feel. I do know what I think and feel about that and that's horrible. You can't even pay for something with your own life.
But this is part of the trauma or the evil of the kind of discourse that Knight is skewering here. And that's that if you make me responsible for my ancestors' sins, then there is no way I could repay or repair this. The debt is too great. You go back enough generations, you are descended from how many people?
Yeah.
Oh, look, I have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-grandparents, and pretty soon it's everyone who's ever lived and all of their sins, and I can't bear the weight of my own sins, much less the weight of my accumulated ancestry.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure there's some ancestor in the Gaulish Empire that committed a war crime.
Oh, I don't even have to go that far back. I have known slave-owning ancestors in the American South. I go back far enough on one side of the family, and it gets dark really fast. I have ancestors that fought for the Confederacy. And I don't care how you try to parse that. That's pretty ugly.
Yeah.
And that's on the nice side of my family. So it gets dark pretty fast.
Yeah. So then we have kind of a humorous scene, gallows humor.
Yes.
So this is all being televised.
Yes.
He has a makeup artist come in and fix him up because even though it's just a local broadcast, they don't know who might be watching.
Right. So we're getting the local TV news anchor powder on the nose so that there's no glare on the camera.
Yeah. And then he's got a unionized, I guess he is an executioner, but
I don't know if this is going too far, but we've got unionized Canadian Severian. No? We have a torturer.
Yeah.
Okay.
We do. We literally have a torturer. And his whole thing is you tell him.
Yes.
How do you want to start?
Yeah. Condemns choice. Arms, nose, legs. How about the kneecaps? I haven't done kneecaps in ages.
Yeah. And any rules about how small it can be? Nope. If you want to drag it out, that's your problem.
Okay, then, pull out my hair 1 strand at a time. What?
I assume he's just trying to stall here.
Yeah, he wants to live as long as possible. Mm-hmm. And I mean, some people are hairy enough that could delay their death for a while.
Yeah. And that's where we get a interruption here.
Yes. Deus Ex Machina.
Yep. Our cheap, flashing gal from the genetics store shows up. And they've got good news. So while she was researching, she actually found out that so it's your twice great-grandfather, Joseph Penny.
The slave abolitionist, ?
Yeah. I suppose he was an abolitionist. He was a slave.
A slave? ! And all caps.
Holster was checking the documents. He looked irritated. The wrecker began to fidget.
The wrecker, of course, being our knockoff Severian here.
Yeah, our torturer. Is this going to take long? My coffee break starts in 5 minutes.
And this is hilarious for anyone who's ever worked with unionized employees.
And so she responds, yes, Mr. Smith, a slave. He was captured by Arab slave traders in North Africa about 1852. Then Arabs! ! He was released on the death of his master, headed north, and started a prosperous business.
But then his shop was smashed by a mob and his home burned to the ground.
Holster grumbled loudly and his left eye began to twitch. He returned to the South and was eventually adopted by a native band. When the band was forcibly relocated by the government, he died on the journey from a combination of malnutrition and disease.
What a horrible life.
Yes, isn't it wonderful, Mr. Smith?
I know, this is great. So he's so excited because he has an ancestor who was oppressed, which will then, on some level, redeem him.
And maybe even get him money back from the It's a Big Enough Thing.
Unfortunately, the Wrecker, our Severian character, has at least one action to take. And That's it. I'm off to break. And then Mr. Smith screams, "My finger! You tore off my finger!" Sorry, buddy. Union rules. Something's got to come off or I don't get paid.
Why should a working man like me suffer because of you?
So here we are making it literal again.
And with that, he's free to go. The
Yes.
papers are in order. It looks like you might even be getting something back on top of it all.
And then he exclaims, "I'm bleeding to death."
Yeah, so his fingers ripped off and he's laying up there on the stage, wildly rolling about.
Yeah, "I'm bleeding to death. Then quick, sign this so I get my commission. We working girls have to watch out for what's ours." So the research person wants his signature before he dies.
Mm-hmm.
And then Hieronius rolled about the stage wildly, and Holster sniffed in disgust. "Such a fuss over a little blood. Madam, would you care to join me for lunch?"
So he's asking her out on a date and
Yes!
not providing no medical assistance whatsoever.
Yeah. Oh, and he's still tied up because he cries out, "Someone untie me."
And so we end with, "Congratulations, Mr. Smith. You're a very lucky man. Be sure to have someone look at your wound. Can't be too careful."
Oh my goodness. Okay. Last comments on the story. Summative comments on the story. What do you think? Does it work as satire? Is it too over the top? Is it not over the top enough?
I think it works.
Okay.
I read this in the same vein as the Kurt Vonnegut story with Harrison Bergeron.
Yes.
And that one, we have literally a handicapper general, and she runs around with a shotgun and shoots someone because they're dancing better than...
We all have to be brought down to the same level.
Yeah. And so I think this one definitely works. There's certain points where I think the culture has continued moving on.
Right.
And what was satire in the story is now true in some ways.
Yeah. It's now TikTok discourse.
What about you?
I land with you that this is clearly satirical. It's over the top. But if Harrison Bergeron works, then this works. And I think it does. This is a set of absurdity that we're more uncomfortable with having satirized. So the handicapper general, okay, we can see how that's ridiculous and how recognizing that it's ridiculous isn't necessarily politically incorrect or socially unacceptable. But in this case, it does kind of seem like this satire is going to be less socially acceptable, which our afterword does spend way too much time on, because there is a real sense that culturally we haven't addressed the legacy of the trauma of the past. Reparations are, I'm not saying they're necessarily as a live question. I think they are on some level a live question because nobody ever dealt with this.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of things that are out there as open questions, like what do we do about a colonial past? You've got people going around and doing things like Indigenous lands acknowledgement, where you acknowledge that you're on stolen land. But then those are empty words that don't fix anything. And nobody's really making a move to give the land back. But we are trying to make ourselves more aware that we've taken land.
Yeah, that feels so hollow. Let me put a slideshow in my
Right.
PowerPoint. And it's like, are we actually addressing any issues?
Well, it's not fixing anything. It is talking about it, where for generations we don't talk about it. We didn't talk about it. But then once you start to unpack these things, again, not saying that you can't or shouldn't address these issues, but once you start to address these issues, you have to recognize, you have to acknowledge that you aren't going to be able to fix them. Acknowledging them does not necessarily fix them. And I think that Knight is getting at some of that. And if you do start trying to fix things, you have to have some kind of coherent philosophy, or it's going to be ridiculous very, very fast.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because the more research that's done on shared trauma that goes throughout generations.
Right. Epigenetics and all of that.
Yeah, like just a lot of stuff's coming out, and it gets to feel like it's an insurmountable problem.
Yeah.
And I have no idea what the answer is, but I do agree with Knight's I believe this is the assertion here, like, it can't just be a circus and bread for the people.
Right.
It has to be...
Televised torture is somehow going to pay back past trauma.
Yeah, and then you'll be used as fertilizer on the fields.
Yeah. Well, it is just, we're perpetuating trauma as though that's going to heal trauma. And it really gets to the heart of the empty core of discourse without love. The only thing that can heal pain and trauma is beauty and love. And is sort of a weaponizing or getting into a arms race of oppression is neither beauty nor love. As someone who has more than passing familiarity with different kinds of generational trauma, talking about it and recognizing it and properly identifying and understanding it is incredibly important. But that's no more than a scientific labeling, a diagnostic set of criteria. You can't stop there, and you probably shouldn't even start there. That has to be a component of something larger. Otherwise, we're just going to be setting up macabre museums of people's pain. Living with it's bad enough. Having it all pinned up on a corkboard with labels doesn't make it better and may make it worse.
Yeah, they're people.
Yeah.
It's difficult because you have to recognize that everybody involved is a person. It's hard to do that because here we have the air quotes, the bad guys, or they want to abstract. But you see it a lot too, where it's like people who are actually trying to do something that they perceive as a good thing. And then they abstract it. And it's like, well, start getting into no true Scotsman's fallacies. Where it's like, well, everybody that, like, it's like, well, what about so-and-so? Wow.
Yeah. And you get into all kinds of objectification and trauma that then compounds. Like, this is part of the problem with a lot of charitable efforts as well. It's like, okay, well, conditions in this developing country are so terrible that they need intervention and assistance. And it's our fault because our ancestors were colonial exploiters. Well, then that means that we have an obligation to go in and fix things. And then that fixing of things just becomes a new layer of trauma as you go in and take away people's agency and oppress them in a pseudo-benevolent way, but very much a traumatizing way. And if you read up on NGOs and the behavior of people who run NGOs, then you're like, this isn't even pseudo-good. It's just evil masquerading as evil. So I think satire like this is healthy and necessary. And I really liked this story. So I laughed in a dark way.
Yep. Well, and one thing too, with the stories of knights that I've read, we'll probably get to these at some point, but there's one where he's dealing with like a serial killer and one where he's dealing with a house that's eating people. But everything that he has is like, there's like this buoyant cheerfulness in it. So even when he's dealing with heavy themes, it's not grimdark.
No, he has such a sunshininess about him. And this is, I'm cheating because of course I've read a number of his stories. And he does. There just seems to be such a redemptive joy in his perspective on the world.
I agree with that. I did want to pull out this quote here from the afterword because needless to say, Knight's story is, to use current parlance, exceedingly and unapologetically politically incorrect.
Yeah. Why did you want to pull that out of the afterword?
Because the afterword is as long as the story.
Yes.
And it is very, I don't know, I don't think it was needed.
It seems totally unnecessary. It is so apologetic that you feel like, why did you bother to publish this story if you were going to spend this much time trying to justify the concept of satire as though readers in 2015 have never encountered a satire before? And I don't know, maybe that's their reading public and the editors were legitimately concerned about this. But I think, okay, not to go all downfall of civilization on you, but if you can't publish a satire that is, and it literally says, it is self-evidently a satire. If you can't publish a self-evident satire and expect people to get it, what are we doing?
I don't know. We're just two people talking into mics on
That's
the internet.
true.
So
Safely hiding behind our keyboards and our mics. I mean, the publication is called Feast of Laughter. You are supposed to laugh. And even if you're very bothered by Knight's take on this situation, Hieronymus gets his finger ripped off. So maybe you'll be satisfied by that.
Oh, I think that says something more about the reader than it does about the story.
The Unreliable Narrators are Amanda Patchen and Brent Towle. And, as Gene Wolfe said, then I could not help wondering what the watching gods thought of us with all our clever masks and our jokes. What we think of crickets, perhaps, whose singing we hear with pleasure, though some of us smash them with our heels when they venture into sight.